literature-loving friends. I remember the first time I stepped into the darkened cinema and found myself plunged beneath the surface of the ocean into a world that shimmered with myth, spectacle, and the ancient pull of stories older than memory. Aquaman 2018 was, at first glance, a comic book adventure, a tale of superheroes and kingdoms at war. But as the lights of the screen spread across my face, I felt myself pulled into something older, something almost mythological. I found echoes of Homer and Virgil, of the great sea epics that once carried sailors across uncharted waters, wrapped in the bright colors of a modern blockbuster. It was as though I had been given entry into an underwater Iliad, a tale that fused the weight of destiny with the playfulness of fantasy. What I carried with me when I left the theater was not only the image of Jason Momoa striding out of the sea, but the memory of having wandered into a story where spectacle and myth coexisted in uneasy harmony, daring me to believe again in the power of the ocean as a stage for human imagination. The film's opening gestures were not subtle. The love story between a lighthouse keeper and a queen from beneath the waves, a romance doomed and yet fertile, out of which a child was born to straddle two worlds. As soon as I saw the lighthouse, its lonely beam cutting across the storm, I knew I was not merely watching a superhero origin, but a fable about belonging and exile, about the child of two worlds forced to choose between them. The sea in that opening was not just backdrop. It was fate itself, violent and beautiful, claiming and rejecting in the same breath. I felt my heart stir as though I were reading a passage from mythology, where the gods interfere in mortal lives and leave behind children who will grow to carry burdens greater than themselves. What unsettled me, though, was how quickly the story oscillated between myth and spectacle. The film was unafraid of grandeur, vast battles beneath the waves, creatures summoned from the depths, kingdoms painted in glowing light. And yet in the midst of all this, there was a humor, a self-awareness, as though the film winked at us and reminded us that myth need not be solemn to be powerful. I found myself laughing in one scene, and then holding my breath in all the next, recognizing that the ocean itself is never only one thing. It can be playful and terrifying, bountiful and merciless, gentle in its tides and violent in its storms. The film mirrored that contradiction, asking me to see that myth is not diminished by laughter, but made alive by it. As the story unfolded, I found myself drawn less to mechanics of plot and more to the symbolic weight it carried. A man caught between two worlds, rejected by both yet destined to rule. What is this if not the eternal story of exile? Arthur Curry is not simply a superhero. He is a wanderer, the outcast, the child of forbidden love who must journey back into the land as a strange people. That archetype carries with it centuries of resonance, from Oedipus to Moses to Theseus. Watching him dive into the depths to reclaim his birthright, I felt the weight of those echoes pressing on me. It reminded me that every comic book story, however flashy, is a descendant of older myths, that the cape and the trident are but modern forms of ancient symbols. What dazzled me visually was how the filmmakers embraced excess. The underwater world was painted in neon. Creatures darted like living jewels. Battle scenes exploded with more colors than the eye could hold. At times it was overwhelming, almost gaudy, and yet I realized that was the point. The ocean, after all, is overwhelming. Its beauty is not subtle but extravagant, its creatures luminous and bizarre, its landscapes alien. The film's excess was a mirror of that truth, an attempt to capture the impossibility of representing the sea. I remember thinking that this was not realism, nor was it meant to be. It was a fantasy that wanted to overwhelm, to drown the senses, to remind us of the scale of the myth we were entering. The emotional center of the first act lay in Arthur's resistance to destiny. He is reluctant, dismissive, quick to joke away responsibility. That resistance struck me as deeply human, because who among us does not shy away from the weight of expectation? The story of reluctant heroes is one of the oldest we tell, because it mirrors our own hesitation to accept the burdens life hands us. Watching Arthur resist his mother's world, scoff at politics, and retreat to the safety of surface life, I felt both amusement and sympathy. He is not noble in the traditional sense. He is messy, brash, reluctant, and yet that messiness makes his journey toward acceptance all the more resonant, because when he finally embraces his role, it is not as a perfect mythic king, but as a flawed man choosing to rise above his reluctance. The romance with Mera introduced another layer of mythic resonance. She is not merely a companion, but a guide, a voice in a world he resists, pulling him toward destiny. Their partnership reminded me of classical epics where the hero is guided by a divine or semi-divine figure, someone who sees more clearly than he does. Yet she is also no passive muse. She is a warrior in her own right, commanding water, fearless in battle. Their dynamic unsettled the traditional gender roles of myth even as it played within them, creating a tension that reflected modern sensibilities without erasing ancient echoes. As the story deepened, the theme of brotherhood and rivalry emerged with ORM, Arthur's half-brother, who seeks to unite the kingdoms of the sea against the surface world. Here again, the film tapped into archetypes as old as Cain and Abel, Romulus and Remus, brothers divided by vision, by love, by inheritance. What struck me was that ORM is not a simple villain. His anger at the surface world's destruction of the oceans carries a truth we cannot ignore. His cruelty is undeniable, but his cause is not wholly false. This complexity reminded me that myths often give us villains whose grievances carry a shadow of truth, forcing us to confront uncomfortable realities. I remember the moment Arthur stood before the ancient trident, a relic of kingship buried in the depths, guarded by a monstrous creature. That scene felt like pure myth, the hero descending into the underworld, facing the guardian beast, proving worth through courage. When the creature recognized his ability to listen, to hear its voice, I was struck by the symbolism. Power here is not seized by force, but by humility, by the willingness to hear what others cannot. That theme resonated deeply with me, because it suggested that true kingship is not domination, but attunement, not strength alone, but empathy. By the time the first act closed and the larger battles loomed, I realized I had been drawn fully into the rhythm of the story. The spectacle had become familiar, the humor had softened the grandeur, and the mythic weight had settled into my bones. I was no longer questioning whether this was serious art. I was letting myself be carried by it, the way one lets the tide pull them from shore. That surrender is rare for me, because I often resist spectacle, preferring quiet reflection. But here, the spectacle was itself reflection, the ocean of images a metaphor for the depths of myth. What I want to leave you with in this introduction is not a summary of plot, but a sense of the feeling. The sense of standing on a shoreline, watching waves crash, knowing that beneath them lies a world of kingdoms, battles, betrayals, and destinies as old as story itself. To watch this film is to dive into that world, to be overwhelmed by its color and sound, to be reminded that myth still lives, disguised in the neon glow of modern cinema. And as we step forward into the deeper waters of its plot, I invite you to carry that sense with you, the recognition that behind every superhero adventure lies the eternal human need to tell ourselves stories of exile and belonging, of rivalry and destiny, of freedom and fate. As the story begins to move beyond its opening gestures, I felt the pull of myth deepen, carrying me with Arthur into the contested waters that shaped his life. The lighthouse where his parents' brief love once burned becomes only a memory, a symbol of a union that could not endure. From there, we are thrust into Arthur's uneasy present, a man grown, yet reluctant to claim the destiny that fate has written for him. What struck me immediately was how the narrative oscillated between spectacle and intimacy, between vast ocean battles and small, personal reckonings. It was this tension that held me, the sense that beneath the neon glow of underwater kingdoms lay the same eternal questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? Arthur begins his journey not as a king, but as an outsider. His reputation is known on the surface as Aquaman, the half-breed who rescues sailors and confronts pirates. But beneath the waves he is scorned, a bastard child unfit for a throne. I remember the thrill of the opening action sequence aboard a submarine, where Arthur fights Black Manta and his mercenaries. The fight itself is kinetic, brutal, filled with Jason Momoa's swaggering energy, but what stayed with me was the encounter with Black Manta himself. Here we meet a man whose rage will become personal, fueled by Arthur's choice not to save his father. In that decision lies one of the film's earliest provocations, that even a hero's choices carry shadows, and that vengeance can be born not only of evil but of grief. From there, the story pivots to the politics of Atlantis, and I found myself suddenly immersed in a world as complex as any courtly intrigue from Shakespeare or Homer. ORM, Arthur's half-brother, plots to unite the underwater kingdoms in war against the surface world, his argument fueled by centuries of pollution and exploitation. watching him stand in regal fury, declaring that the humans above are poisoning the seas. I felt a chill of recognition. His words were grotesque in their cruelty, but they carried truth. The oceans are poisoned. The surface world does exploit. ORM becomes not only a villain, but a voice of uncomfortable reality, a reminder that myths often reveal the truths we wish to ignore. Mera enters Arthur's story here as both guide and challenger. Her presence unsettled me, because she is not the gentle muse of myth, but a fierce warrior, commanding water with grace and ferocity. She sees in Arthur's potential for kingship even when he denies it, and she insists that his reluctance must give way to responsibility. Their journey together begins with conflict. He mocks her, resists her pleas, scoffs at the very idea of ruling. Yet as they travel together, the tension between them shifts into respect, and then into something like love. What struck me was how their dynamic reflected an ancient pattern. The reluctant hero guided by a figure who sees further than he does, but twisted it into something modern, where guidance does not erase equality, but demands it. The first half of the story is structured as a quest, and I could feel the archetypal weight of that form. Arthur and Mera travel in search of the lost trident of Atlan, the artifact that would grant its wielder true kingship. This is no different than Theseus seeking his father's sword, or Odysseus braving the underworld. Along the way, they pass through wonders and dangers that test Arthur's resolve. One of the most memorable of these is a journey into the hidden deserts, where they discover clues to the trident's location. The juxtaposition of ocean heroes trudging through sand fascinated me. It reminded me of how myths often place heroes in alien landscapes to test them, to show that they must master not only their native element, but the opposites that resist them. What lingers in my mind from this portion of the film are the contrasts. The neon glow of Atlantis, its kingdoms teeming with sea creatures and armored guards, set against the intimate exchanges between Arthur and Mera as they argue about responsibility. The brutal violence of ORM's armies contrasted with the tenderness of Arthur's memories of his mother, Queen Atlanta, who was forced to abandon him for his safety. These contrasts remind me that myth thrives on contradiction, on the collision between grandeur and vulnerability. Arthur is at once a swaggering warrior and a child mourning his absent mother, a man mocked as half-breed, and yet destined to be whole. The first confrontation between Arthur and ORM struck me as pure tragedy. Two brothers, divided by birth and belief, clash in a ceremonial duel, tridents crashing in a ballet of violence. I remember the moment when Arthur, though powerful, is overwhelmed by ORM's master of the ocean, nearly killed in the arena. It was a reminder that heroes do not ascend easily, that myth demands failure before triumph. Watching him beaten, I felt the weight of exile once again. He is not yet ready, not yet the king, not yet the bridge between worlds. And in that failure, the story deepens, because it forces him onto the longer path of growth. Their escape with Mera from the arena into the broader ocean opens the second act of the journey. I remember the images of them pursued by ORM soldiers, the sense of flight and danger, the recognition that destiny cannot be delayed forever. Yet even in these scenes of spectacle, the film allowed space for reflection. Arthur's reluctance begins to soften, his humor masking less, and his seriousness beginning to emerge. He starts to see that his birthright is not only a burden, but a possibility. That perhaps he is meant for more than swagger and brawls. That dawning awareness moved me, because it mirrored the universal journey from avoidance to acceptance, from resisting responsibility to embracing it. As the first half draws toward its close, Arthur and Mera's quest leads him into the hands of clues older than memory, inscriptions and riddles that point toward the lost trident. This shift into the mythic reminded me of Indiana Jones as much as Homer, the blend of adventure cinema and ancient allegory. What mattered most was not the clue itself, but what it demanded of Arthur. Humility, perseverance, willingness to trust Mera's guidance. The man who mocked her in the beginning now leans on her, recognizing that destiny cannot be faced alone. That growth, subtle yet profound, becomes the heartbeat of the first half. By the time the desert sands give way to revelations, by the time Arthur begins to glimpse the shape of the destiny waiting for him, I realized how much the first half had prepared me. It had given me spectacle, yes, submarines, duels, neon kingdoms. But beneath that, it had given me archetypes reborn. The reluctant hero, the guide, the rival brother, the absent mother, the quest for a sacred relic. It had given me myth disguised as blockbuster, poetry cloaked in spectacle. And as Arthur and Mera prepared to plunge deeper into the heart of the ocean's secrets, I felt myself ready to follow, knowing that the second half would carry them and me into even darker and stranger depths. As the story shifts into its second half, I felt the weight of myth grow heavier, pulling Arthur and Mera deeper into trials that would test not only their strength, but their vision of themselves. Having stumbled through deserts and ancient riddles, they now move into stranger waters, where danger and revelation intertwine, and where the clash between personal destiny and the fate of kingdoms becomes impossible to avoid. What I loved here was how the film doubled down on both its spectacle and its intimacy, expanding its scope into battles between armies, and yet pausing to let its characters wrestle with who they are and what they mean to one another. The quest leads them first to Sicily, a land above water, bathed in sunlight and warmth, where Arthur for the first time seems to relax into something like joy. I remember the sequence of him and Mera walking through markets, tasting food, watching fireworks, a scene almost romantic in its lightness. For a moment, the epic pauses to remind us that even reluctant heroes deserve tenderness, that myth is not only made of battles, but of laughter and companionship. Yet the idol is shattered when ORM's mercenaries arrive, sending Arthur and Mera into battle among crumbling rooftops. I was struck by how quickly the tone shifted from joy to peril, as though to remind us that destiny never allows heroes to rest for long. The destruction of the village mirrored the fragility of their peace, a warning that personal happiness must be sacrificed for greater duty. What followed was one of the film's most breathtaking sequences, the plunge into the trench. This moment remains etched in my memory, not only for its visual beauty, but for its symbolic resonance. The trench is a kingdom of monstrous, mindless creatures, embodiment of the ocean's most primal terrors. As Arthur and Mera dive into darkness, their only light the flare that cuts through the black, the screen fills with swarming shadows, creatures surging like nightmares given form. I remember holding my breath as their tiny boat was surrounded, the flare illuminating not only their desperate flight, but the vastness of the horde pursuing them. This descent into the abyss felt like pure myth, the hero's journey into the underworld, where the terrors of unconscious fear rise to devour him. And yet, within this terror, Arthur presses forward, refusing retreat, a gesture that felt to me like the first true acceptance of his destiny. Their passage through the trench delivers them to a hidden sea at the Earth's core, a secret world untouched by time. Here lies the Trident of Atlan, guarded by the colossal creature Caradhan. This moment is the heart of the myth, the hero facing the guardian beast, not with force but with humility. What astonished me was how Arthur triumphed not by fighting, but by listening, by hearing the voice of a creature that others could not. The symbolism struck me deeply. True kingship is not the ability to dominate, but the willingness to understand, not strength alone, but attunement to what lies beneath the surface. As Caradhan bowed to him, I realized that Arthur had become more than warrior. He had become bridge, the one who listens to voices silenced by arrogance. Meanwhile, ORM tightens his grip on Atlantis, declaring himself ocean master and forging alliances through fear. His armies prepare to wage war on the surface, and the imagery of vast underwater legions gathering in neon-lit formations unsettled me with its grandeur. ORM, for all his cruelty, embodies conviction, and his speeches reveal the paradox of his villainy. He is both wrong and right, brutal in his methods, but justified in his rage a human destruction of the seas. I found myself troubled, because myths often give us villains who reflect uncomfortable truths, and ORM is no different. He is the voice of anger at injustice twisted into tyranny, a reminder that even righteous cause can become monstrous when pursued through domination. The climax builds toward the great battle between ORM's forces and those loyal to Arthur. This spectacle is overwhelming. Vast armies of crab-like creatures, sharks armor for war, soldiers riding sea dragons, all colliding in a riot of color and motion. Watching it, I felt as though I were witnessing a page torn from an illuminated manuscript, a medieval battle reimagined beneath the waves. Yet amid this chaos, what mattered most was Arthur's emergence in his true form, clad in the golden armor of Atlantis, wielding the trident of Atlan, striding not as half-breed but as king. I remember the shiver of recognition. This was the moment of apotheosis. The reluctant hero transformed. The exile becomes sovereign. It was spectacle, yes, but it was also poetry, a visual metaphor for acceptance and transformation. The battle turns when Arthur commands a caravan, the colossal beast rising from the depths to shatter ORM's armies. This image struck me with mythic force, recalling Poseidon's mastery of the seas, or Beowulf's descent into the monster's lair. To see Arthur riding the creature, trident in hand, was to witness the fusion of man and myth, the fulfillment of the prophecy that a bridge between worlds would come. Yet, what moved me most was not the destruction, but the recognition that his power came not from conquest, but from harmony, from his ability to listen to the Carathan's voice. This is kingship redefined, not domination but communion. The final confrontation between Arthur and ORM is stripped of armies, a return to intimacy. Brothers face each other again. Tridents clashing, this time not in ceremonial arena but on the open stage of history. The duel is fierce, but Arthur's growth has transformed him. He no longer fights only with strength but with wisdom, no longer resists his destiny, but embraces it. When he defeats ORM, it is not with cruelty but with restraint, sparing his brother's life. That act of mercy struck me as a true climax, the moment when Arthur transcended vengeance and proved himself king not by winning, but by choosing compassion. The resolution is both triumphant and tender. Queen Atlanta, long thought dead, is revealed alive, her reunion with Arthur healing the wound of abandonment that haunted his childhood. To see her embrace him, to see the family restored even in fractured form, was to witness the closing of a circle, the reconciliation that myths so often demand. Mera stands beside Arthur as partner, equal in strength and vision, reminding us that no king rules alone. And Arthur himself, once reluctant, once mocked as half-breed, now stands as king of Atlantis, bridge between surface and sea, bearer of a destiny he has chosen at last. As the credits approached, I found myself thinking not of the battles or the spectacle, but of the myth beneath it all. A child of two worlds, exiled yet destined, reluctant yet triumphant, becoming whole by embracing the contradictions of his birth. This is not only Arthur's story, but ours, literature-loving friends. For who among us does not feel torn between worlds, caught between expectations, mocked for what we are, yet yearning to become more? Watching Arthur rise from exile to sovereignty reminded me that myths endure because they speak to these fractures within us, and because they dare to imagine that from exile can come reconciliation, from reluctance can come greatness. When I think back on this film, what lingers most vividly are the characters themselves, not only for what they do in the story, but for what they symbolize, the contradictions they embody, the truths they reveal about us. They are not merely figures in a comic book narrative, but archetypes dressed in modern costume, carrying with them echoes of myth and legend while speaking to the anxieties of our own age. To analyze them is to peel back the layers of spectacle and look at the human heart beating beneath the neon waves. Arthur Curry, Aquaman himself, stands at the center of this tapestry as a figure of exile and reconciliation. His identity as the son of a lighthouse keeper and the Queen of Atlantis makes him a child of two worlds, yet belonging to neither. I was struck by how deeply his reluctance to embrace destiny mirrors the reluctance so many of us feel when faced with responsibility larger than ourselves. He hides his vulnerability behind bravado, jokes away his fear, and resists the call to lead. And yet, as the film unfolds, we see him transform, not by abandoning his contradictions, but by embracing them. What I found compelling was that his kingship is not earned through conquest alone, but through humility, through his ability to listen to the voice of the caravan, through his decision to show mercy to ORM. His character reminds me that true strength lies not in domination, but in balance, that leadership is not about silencing contradictions, but about carrying them with courage. Mera fascinated me for the way she redefined the role of guide in myth. She is not a passive companion, but a warrior, commanding the ocean itself with fierce beauty. From the beginning, she sees Arthur's potential more clearly than he does, and she challenges him to rise beyond his reluctance. Yet she is never reduced to being only his helper. She has her own will, her own convictions, her own strength. What I admired most was her refusal to let Arthur's humor and avoidance diminish her resolve. She insists on his greatness not for her sake, but for the sake of the world. And in doing so, she becomes not muse but equal, a partner who demands reciprocity. Her character struck me as a symbol of modern myth-making, where women no longer serve merely as catalysts for male growth, but as full participants in the shaping of destiny. ORM, the Ocean Master, is one of the most complex antagonists I have encountered in superhero cinema. He is regal, furious, convinced of his own righteousness. What unsettled me was how much truth underlay his fury. The surface world is destroying the oceans, polluting, exploiting, killing. His rage is justified, his cause real, yet his methods twist justice into tyranny. This tension made him feel more like a tragic figure than a simple villain. He reminded me of Shakespeare's antagonists, characters who might have been heroes if only they had chosen differently. His conflict with Arthur is not merely about power but about vision. ORM sees only division. Arthur dares to imagine reconciliation. Watching him fall at the end, spared by Arthur's mercy, I could not help but feel pity as well as relief, because his downfall was also the downfall of the truth spoken in fury, that the seas are indeed suffering, and that anger, though misdirected, came from real pain. Queen Atlanta embodies the archetype of the sacrificed mother, the one who abandons her child to save him, the one who is thought lost but returns in the moment of reconciliation. Her story carries with it echoes of countless myths where the mother's absence shapes the hero's journey. What struck me was how her presence haunted Arthur throughout his childhood, her absence forming a wound that could not heal until she was restored. When she returned, alive after all, I felt a catharsis of reunion, not only for Arthur but for us as viewers, who had carried that absence with him. Her character symbolizes both the cruelty of fate and the possibility of redemption, a reminder that love lost may sometimes be found again. Black Manta, though occupying a smaller portion of the film, brought with him the raw force of vengeance. His origin, born from Arthur's refusal to save his father, transforms him into an enemy defined by grief as much as by hatred. What fascinated me was that his fury is understandable, even sympathetic, even as it leads him into cruelty. He is a reminder that choices carry consequences, that even heroes cannot act without leaving scars behind. His armor, sleek and alien, makes him a figure of menace, but beneath it beats the heart of a man broken by loss. I found his presence haunting because he represents the shadow Arthur cannot escape, the reminder that every act of refusal leaves someone hurt. Even secondary characters carried symbolic weight. Nuidus Volko mentored Arthur, becomes the archetype of the wise counselor, guiding from the shadows, teaching patience and skill. Though less flamboyant than others, his role reminded me of Merlin guiding Arthur of Camelot, the patient voice of tradition helping a reluctant hero find his way. The kingdom's generals, the crab armies, the guardians of the trident, all these figures become part of the mythic chorus, embodiment of archetypes that surround and test a hero. What unites all these characters is contradiction. Arthur is both human and Atlantean, reluctant and destined. Mera is both guide and equal, fierce and tender. ORM is both villain and prophet, cruel and truthful. Atlanta is both absent and present, lost and found. Black Manta is both sympathetic and terrifying. Each of them resists simplification, embodying the truth that myths endure not because they give easy answers, but because they hold contradictions that mirror our own. As I reflect on them, literature-loving friends, I realize that what moved me most was not their perfection, but their imperfection. Arthur stumbles, ORM rages, Mera scolds, Atlanta abandons, Manta hates. And yet, through these flaws, the story breathes, becomes human, becomes ours. To analyze them is to see ourselves reflected in the mirror of myth, to recognize that we too are contradictions, half-breeds of different worlds, torn between anger and compassion, between exile and belonging. These characters, clothed in armor and fantasy, remind us of the truths we carry in our own lives, truths as messy and luminous as the ocean itself. What I love most about reflecting on this film is uncovering the strangeness that bubbles beneath its glossy surface, the peculiar details and behind-the-scenes oddities that make it feel like more than just another blockbuster. When I look back on Aquaman 2018, I realize that what gives its peculiar texture are not only the mythic arcs and sweeping battles, but the strange little facts, the unexpected choices, the moments that make you pause and think, how on earth did this exist in a film of this scale? It is in those details, both intentional and accidental, that the movie becomes something singular. One of the strangest facts lies in the sheer audacity of its design. Most superhero films lean on muted palettes and realism to ground their fantasy, but here the filmmakers chose excess. Neon kingdoms, armored sharks, crab legions, glowing jellyfish palaces. It is as though they decided the ocean should look like a rave painted across the ruins of ancient myth. The fact that such choices were not only made, but embraced by a major studio still amazes me. Hollywood is often cautious, preferring safe design, yet here they allowed James Wan to flood the screen with psychedelic imagery that bordered on absurd. Watching armies of crustaceans march into war against soldiers riding sharks felt like witnessing a fever dream with a $200 million budget. That strangeness is part of its charm, reminding us that sometimes art emerges from indulgence rather than restraint. Another curious fact is the way the film blends tones that should not coexist. At one moment, Arthur is cracking jokes with Jason Momoa's surfer biker swagger, and in the next, we are plunged into mythic gravitas, watching a queen sacrifice herself to save her child. Most films would stumble under such shifts, yet this one somehow thrives on them, as though strangeness would glue that held it together. That tonal inconsistency became a style in itself, a reminder that the ocean is never one thing but many, calm and storm, playful and terrifying. For me, the strangest fact was not that the film shifted tone, but that it worked, that humor and myth did not cancel each other, but made the world feel alive in its contradictions. The creatures themselves were another marvel of strangeness. The Kara, then, voiced by Julie Andrews of all people, remains one of the most bizarre casting choices I have ever encountered. To hear the beloved voice of Mary Poppins emerge in the mouth of colossal, tentacle monster was both surreal and delightful. That casting decision fascinates me, because it shows how deeply the filmmakers embrace contradiction, combining a voice associated with gentleness and nurture with an image of grotesque monstrosity. The fact that Andrews chose his role after declining in appearance in Mary Poppins Returns makes it even stranger. She rejected her own legacy to voice a sea monster in a superhero film. That detail, to me, embodies the eccentric spirit of the entire production. There are also oddities in how the film engaged with mythology. On the surface, it is a DC Comics adaptation, but beneath that, it is littered with references to classical epics. Arthur is reluctant heir like Moses or Theseus. The quest for Atlan's trident like the search for Excalibur. The descent into the trench like Orpheus into the underworld. What makes this strange is how openly the film wears its mythological borrowings, almost as if it were less concerned with originality than with reveling in archetypes. The fact that audiences embrace this instead of dismissing it as derivative tells me something about our hunger for myth, that even dressed in neon, with jokes about beer and tattoos, we still crave stories that echo the ancient. Another peculiar fact is how the actors themselves leaned into absurdity. Jason Momoa has said in interviews that he embraced Arthur's bro energy precisely because it contrasted with the grandeur of the setting. He did not want Aquaman to feel like a polished mythic king, but like a guy you might meet at a bar, who suddenly reveals he can command the seas. That decision is strange in its boldness, casting the savior of Atlantis as a figure of laid-back charisma rather than solemn majesty. And yet it worked, precisely because the strangeness disarmed us. Watching him shout, "Yah!" while leaping onto a giant creature felt absurd, but also exhilarating. It is as though the film wanted to remind us that myth can be fun, that strangeness can liberate rather than alienate. The very production of underwater scenes carried its own oddities. Rather than submerging actors for long shoots, the filmmakers developed new technology to simulate weightless underwater movement, with rigs and wires creating the illusion of drifting in currents. The actors had to learn how to move as though buoyant, how to let limbs float unnaturally. To me, the strange fact is that much of the grace we see was manufactured on sound stages, with performers dangling in harnesses while technicians manipulated digital hair to float around them. It fascinates me that the ocean's fluid beauty was created through awkward contraptions, that the grace of myth was born out of mechanical strangeness. The villain ORM's moniker, Ocean Master, carries its own strange resonance. In another context, it might have seemed laughable, a name too campy to be taken seriously. Yet Patrick Wilson delivered it with such conviction that it became strangely compelling, reminding me of how myth often embraces titles that border on absurd. Breaker Horses, Slayer Men, Ocean Master, all carry that exaggerated quality. The fact that modern audiences accepted the term without mockery speaks to how the film created a world where such strangeness felt natural. I cannot forget the odd juxtaposition of high-budget spectacle with simple, almost naive moments of sincerity. The scene of young Arthur learning from Volko, training with a trident against painted backdrops of fish, feels almost quaint compared to the neon battles that follow. And yet that simplicity lingers with me more than the spectacle, as though the strangeness of its earnestness cut deeper than the grand designs. Perhaps the strangest fact of all is that beneath all the excess, the film dared to be earnest, dared to give us a hero whose strength lay not in cynicism, but in willingness to care. Finally, I think of the audience response itself as a strange fact. This was a film filled with choices that could have alienated: psychedelic design, tonal chaos, absurd creatures, campy names, and yet became a massive global success, crossing the billion-dollar mark. That, to me, is the strangest fact of all, that something so peculiar, so indulgent, so unabashedly weird could resonate with millions. It tells me that strangeness, when embraced fully, can become strength, that audiences are more open to the bizarre than studios often believe. Looking back, I realize that what makes this film unforgettable are not its conventional elements, but its peculiarities. Julie Andrews voicing a sea monster, neon crab armies, a hero who feels like a surfer bro stepping into legend, battles that look like fevered paintings. These are the strangenesses that turn from product into myth, from spectacle into memory. And it is in those oddities that the film reveals itself as not merely entertainment, but as a modern epic that dares to be strange, and in daring, finds its truth. When I turn my thoughts toward how this film was received by the wider world, I am struck by the sheer variety of critical perspectives it provoked, and the way its release became less a single event than a series of ripples moving outward, reaching audiences and critics in unexpected ways. For a film that could have easily been dismissed as another cog in the superhero machine, Aquaman, 2018, instead became a cultural conversation, sparking debate about tone, myth excess, and even the future of the comic book genre. The events around its premiere and global run turned it into more than a film. It became an occasion, a gathering point for audiences who wanted either to celebrate its wildness or to puzzle over its contradictions. One of the most consistent themes in critical discourse was the sheer extravagance of its visuals. Some critics hailed it as visionary, comparing James Wan's neon underwater realms to Baroque excessive fantasy epics. They admired its willingness to embrace spectacle without apology, its refusal to hide behind muted palettes or gritty realism. Others, however, found the visuals overwhelming, even grotesque, accusing the film of drowning its story in excess. I remember reading reviews that describe it as a glittering mess, a camp masterpiece, or a fever dream painted across the ocean floor. This polarization fascinated me because it showed how the film's greatest strength was also, for some, its greatest flaw. Strangeness, it seems, is always divisive. Another critical thread focused on Jason Momoa's performance. Many praised his charisma, his refusal to play Arthur as a solemn king, his embrace of humor and swagger. They saw in him a refreshing departure from the archetype of the brooding superhero, a reminder that heroes could laugh, drink beer, and still carry the weight of myth. Yet some critics felt his tone undermined the grandeur of the story, that his laid-back energy clashed with the epic stakes. I found this tension revealing, because it mirrored the film's own contradictions, a mythic story told through a modern voice, a reluctant king who seems more like a surfer than a sovereign. Whether critics admired or resisted it, they could not ignore it, and that inability to dismiss speaks volumes. The supporting cast drew its own attention. Amber Heard's Mera was praised for her strength and independence, though some critics felt she was underused, given her potential. Patrick Wilson's ORM divided opinion. Some found him too theatrical, others admired his Shakespearean intensity. Willem Dafoe's Volko drew quiet respect, his performance grounding the spectacle with wisdom. But perhaps the strangest reaction was to Julie Andrews as the voice of the Caravan, which critics ultimately celebrated as a brilliant stroke of casting, or dismissed as a gimmick. The fact that a single vocal cameo could generate such commentary speaks to the film's peculiar hold on cultural imagination. Critical perspectives also lingered on the film's narrative structure. Some found it sprawling, too long, overloaded with subplots. Others admired its ambition, noting how it wove together romance, political intrigue, myth, and adventure. For me, the most interesting reviews were those that recognized its mythological underpinnings. Critics who saw Arthur's quest not merely as a superhero origin, but as a retelling of timeless archetypes. These reviews spoke of Excalibur and Camelot, of underworld descents and rival brothers, of the film as a modern epic disguised in blockbuster clothing. Reading them, I felt reassured that I was not alone in sensing the myth beneath the neon, that others too had recognized the ancient patterns breathing within its story. The premiere events themselves became part of the narrative. In Los Angeles, Jason Momoa performed the haka on the red carpet, a gesture that electrified fans and reminded the world of his Polynesian heritage. That moment was more than publicity. It was a statement of identity, a merging of actor and character, of cultural tradition and modern spectacle. I remember watching clips of it and feeling that the event itself had become mythic, a ritual performed to bless the film's release. Around the world, the premieres carried their own energy, with fans dressing in costumes, underwater-themed displays in theaters, and conversations buzzing online about whether DC had finally found its footing after years of uneven films. The global reception was another fascinating event. In China, the film became a massive success, outperforming expectations and revealing how deeply its spectacle resonated with audiences beyond the United States. Critics noted that the film's visual language, its overwhelming grandeur, its dazzling battle sequences, seemed tailor-made for global appeal, less tied to American cultural specifics and more to universal themes of myth and heroism. This success transformed the film from a domestic gamble into an international triumph, reminding us that cinema is always a dialogue not just with critics, but with audiences across cultures. One curious critical perspective was the way the film was compared to other blockbusters of its era. Some saw it as DC's answer to Marvel's Black Panther, another story of a hidden kingdom, contested kingship, and cultural identity. Others compared its excess to Avatar, pointing out its fascination with bioluminescent worlds and ecological undertones. These comparisons were not always flattering, but they revealed how critics struggled to place it, how its strangeness resisted easy categorization. It was neither purely Marvel-like nor purely fantasy. It was something hybrid, awkward, but undeniably its own. Award season offered its own surprises. Though not expected to dominate critical prizes, the film did earn recognition for its visual effects and design. The fact that such a colorful, extravagant work was acknowledged by traditionally conservative awards bodies struck me as strange but also significant. It suggested that even institutions rooted in tradition could not entirely dismiss the audacity of its craft. And though it did not sweep awards, it won something rarer: the affection of audiences, the devotion of fans who embrace its weirdness as a badge of honor. What I find most interesting in retrospect is how the critical discourse itself mirrored the film's contradictions. Some saw excess where others saw beauty. Some saw silliness where others saw myth. Some saw a messy sprawl where others saw ambitious epic. The perspectives were as divided as the ocean itself. Calm for some, storm for others. And in that division lies the film's significance, because art that provokes only one response rarely endures. It is the works that divide us, that unsettle us, that we argue about, that stay alive in memory. Looking back, literature-loving friends, I realize that the strangest fact of all is that a superhero film, expected to be just another chapter in a crowded genre, became instead a cultural moment, a canvas onto which critics and audiences projected their hopes, frustrations, and dreams. Its movie events, the premieres, the global triumphs, the haka on the red carpet, became part of its myth. Its critical perspectives, praise and scorn alike, became part of its legacy. And so the film lives not only in the frames we watched, but in the conversations we had, in the debates it sparked, in the memory of having witnessed something so audacious that we could not remain silent. That, to me, is the true mark of cinema that matters. When I think about how this film came into being, I am struck not only by the grandeur of its final form, but by the strangeness and audacity of production that shaped it. To bring such a surreal underwater epic to life required technical invention, artistic risk, and a willingness to lean into ideas that might have seemed absurd on paper. Looking back, I find the production itself almost as fascinating as the story, because it reveals how many hands, how many experiments, how many moments of uncertainty went into crafting this fever dream of neon seas and mythic battles. One of the first insights that struck me was the challenge of creating an illusion of underwater life without actually submerging the actors for long stretches. Rather than risk the limitations of real water tanks, the filmmakers developed an elaborate system of rigs, wires, and digital enhancements to simulate buoyancy. Actors were suspended on harnesses, their movements carefully choreographed to create the impression of drifting through currents. Later, in post-production, animators added flowing hair, shifting fabrics, and bubbles to complete the illusion. I found this fascinating because it revealed how much of the ocean's fluidity was born not of nature, but of artifice. How something as graceful as Atlanteans swimming in their neon kingdom was achieved through awkward contraptions and hours of rehearsal. The beauty on screen was stitched together from strangeness behind the scenes. The production design carried its own marvels. James Wan and his team decided early on that they would not shy away from extravagance, but would embrace it. Instead of grounding Atlantis in muted realism, they imagined it as a glowing metropolis of impossible architecture, blending coral forms with futuristic structures, painting the ocean in dazzling color. Concept artists drew inspiration from deep-sea creatures, Baroque art, and even psychedelic posters, creating a look that defied categorization. What amazed me most was how these visions were built into practical sets. Massive sound stages filled with glowing props, sculpted coral thrones, and intricately detailed costumes, before being extended digitally. The combination of physical craftsmanship and digital expansion gave the world its tactile, lived-in feel. Even amid the CGI spectacle, there was weight and presence, a reminder that behind the pixels stood carpenters, painters, and designers bringing imagination into being. Costume design was another fascinating layer. The challenge of designing outfits that looked plausible underwater yet dramatic on land pushed designers into bold territory. ORM's silver armor shimmered with scales that caught light in strange ways. Mara's gown flowed like liquid fabric. Arthur's golden suit evoked classic comic imagery, while gleaming like a modern invention. The strange fact was how much of this was practical. Real suits painstakingly constructed, fitted, and worn on set, later enhanced but not entirely replaced by digital effects. Actors have spoken about the weight and difficulty of moving in these costumes, yet that very difficulty informed the performances, forcing them to embody the heaviness of duty even in scenes where they appeared weightless. The casting process produced its own curiosities. Jason Momoa was not the obvious choice for Aquaman. His rugged, surfer-like charisma contrasted sharply with the character's clean-cut comic book history. Yet James Wan fought for him, wanted to redefine the hero not as a blonde archetype, but as someone embodying Polynesian strength and identity. That choice became one of the film's most radical and successful decisions, reshaping Aquaman's cultural image forever. And then there was a decision to cast Julie Andrews as the voice of the Caravan, a move so strange it almost feels like a private joke between filmmakers and audience. To hear the voice of a beloved musical icon emerge from a monstrous sea creature was both surreal and delightful, a production choice that embodies the film's love of contradiction. Filming on location added another layer of complexity. While much of the ocean world was crafted on sound stages, surface scenes were shot across diverse landscapes, from the coast of Australia to the villages of Sicily. I remember learning that the Sicilian rooftop chase, one of the most exhilarating sequences, was filmed in actual coastal towns, with stunt performers leaping across real tile roofs while explosions erupted around them. That blending of real-world texture with digital enhancement created sequences that felt grounded even in their extravagance. It fascinates me to think of quiet villages suddenly filled with cranes, wires, and actors in superhero costumes. Ordinary streets transformed into stages for myth. One fun fact that delights me is how James Wan drew on horror techniques to shape the trench sequence. Known for his work in horror films like The Conjuring, he approached the descent into the trench as if directing a monster film. Lighting was minimal, shadows stretched, creatures swarmed in ways designed to evoke dread. Crew members described how one insisted on practical effects wherever possible, using models and animatronics to inform the design of the creatures before layering digital work. The result was one of the film's most memorable scenes, blending superhero spectacle with genuine horror. That fusion of genres reveals how the production embraced strangeness, refusing to stay confined within one mode. Behind the scenes, the camaraderie among cast and crew shaped the film's spirit. Jason Momoa's larger-than-life energy reportedly infused the set with humor and warmth. Stories abound of him blasting music between takes, playing pranks, and encouraging others to loosen up. Amber Heard spoke about how his play from this offset the technical grind of harness work and green screen acting. Patrick Wilson leaned fully into his Shakespearean villainy, practicing regal gestures and booming delivery even off-camera, amusing the crew with his intensity. These anecdotes remind me that behind every polished frame lies the messy, human reality of actors sweating in costumes, laughing between takes, struggling with the awkwardness of wires and prosthetics. The editing process carried its own peculiarities. Early cuts reportedly ran far longer, with extended world building that had to be trimmed to keep the narrative flowing. James Wan has spoken about the difficulty of balancing so many kingdoms, subplots, and tonal shifts, and how the final film was a product of countless experiments in pacing. I find it fascinating that what feels sprawling and indulgent on screen is in fact a distilled version of something even stranger, that the extravagance we witness was once even larger. That knowledge makes me wonder what other curiosities lie unseen, buried in deleted scenes and discarded drafts. Even the score carries production insights worth noting. Composer Rupert Gregson-Williams blended traditional orchestral themes with electronic textures, creating a soundscape as hybrid as the film itself. He assigned motifs to characters and kingdoms, layering them together during the climactic battle. The strange fact is how much experimentation went into creating underwater sound, reverb effects, distortions, and layered echoes to suggest immersion. Listening closely, I realized that the music itself was part of the world building, a sonic attempt to make us feel submerged. What I carry with me most, though, is the recognition that production itself mirrored the film's themes. Just as Arthur is a hybrid of two worlds, the film was a hybrid of practical and digital, sincerity and absurdity, myth and spectacle. Just as Arthur must embrace contradiction, the production embraced it too, stitching together elements that should not have worked into a whole that somehow did. Behind the glowing palaces and roaring monsters lies the labor of hundreds of artists and technicians who dared to lean into strangeness, who trusted that audiences would follow them into neon oceans and crab legions. Looking back, literature-loving friends, I realize that the fun facts and production details are not mere trivia, but windows into the soul of the film. They reveal that what looks seamless on screen is stitched together from awkwardness, risk, and play. They remind us that cinema is always artifice, and that its beauty comes not from hiding that artifice, but from embracing it. And in this case, the strangeness of its making is inseparable from the strangeness of its story, both part of the same myth that dares to flood the screen with excess and contradiction. When I think of this film, what comes back to me most vividly is not only its characters or its battles, but the world it created, a world so strange and saturated that it often felt like stepping into a dream. The setting of Aquaman, 2018, is not merely backdrop, but living presence, a landscape that shapes the story as much as any rival or ally. From the lighthouse on a stormy coast to the neon depths of Atlantis, from Sicilian rooftops to the abyss of the trench, each setting speaks its own language, carrying with its symbols and contradictions that deepen the narrative. The cinematic elements, the colors, the camera, the sound, work together to make these settings more than places. They become arguments, reflections of the film's themes, mirrors for the contradictions of Arthur himself. The surface world, though less extravagant than the ocean, plays a crucial role. The lighthouse where Arthur was born is framed with a kind of rugged poetry. Waves crashing, beams cutting through storm, the quiet warmth of his father raising him alone. This setting grounds the story in simplicity, a reminder that mythic heroes are born not in castles, but in modest places, out of ordinary love. I was struck by the contrast between this humble beginning and the extravagant palaces below, as though the film wanted us to see Arthur's humanity as anchor amid the ocean's overwhelming spectacle. The lighthouse is not just setting. It is symbol, a light in the storm, a guide through chaos, a reminder that belonging begins with love, not crowns. Atlantis, by contrast, is the heart of strangeness. Its glowing towers and coral palaces shimmer in colors that defy realism. Pinks, blues, greens so luminous they verge on surreal. Watching it, I felt as though I had stepped into a painting that refused subtlety, a neon dreamscape that dared me to surrender disbelief. The architecture mixes the organic and the technological, core-like structures pulsing with light alongside metallic spires. This hybrid design mirrors Arthur's own hybridity, caught between two worlds, part human, part Atlantean. The setting becomes a metaphor for his identity, dazzling and disorienting, neither natural nor artificial, but both at once. What fascinated me was how each underwater kingdom was given its own distinct setting. The Fisherman Kingdom gleamed with elegance, its citizens slender and artistic, living in shimmering structures like glass reefs. The Brine Kingdom, by contrast, was grotesque and warlike, armies of crabs marching through mud and stone. These contrasts reminded me of how myths often divide realms into archetypal domains, Olympus for gods, Hades for the dead, each with its own flavor. Here, the kingdoms are exaggerated reflections of aspects of the ocean, turned into political allegories. Watching them, I realized the settings were not merely decorative but part of film's world building, giving the ocean a political geography as vivid as any map of empires. The trench sequence remains one of the most unforgettable settings. The descent into black waters, lit only by a single flare, felt like plunging into nightmare. The swarm of creatures surrounding Arthur and Mera, illuminated in brief, terrifying glimpses, created an atmosphere of primal fear. Cinematically, the choice to use minimal light and swarming shadows transformed the setting into a vision of the unconscious, the dark depths of the ocean standing in for the dark depths of the human psyche. It was here that I realized how the film settings doubled as emotional landscapes, the trench embodying fear and chaos, Atlantis embodying power and temptation, the lighthouse embodying memory and love. The Sicilian village sequence offered another striking contrast. Bathed in sunlight, filled with music and markets, it felt almost idyllic, a reminder that not all settings need grandeur to carry meaning. When Arthur and Mera strolled among fireworks and laughter, I felt the warmth of a world untouched by myth, a fleeting glimpse of what life might have been without destiny. Yet when soldiers attacked, that same setting crumbled into peril, rooftops collapsing as the lovers fled. The setting became fragile, showing how easily beauty can be destroyed by the intrusion of power. It reminded me of the way myths often allow heroes moments of happiness only to strip them away, forcing them back onto the path of fate. Cinematically, the use of color was one of the most striking elements of the film. James Wan and his team rejected the muted tones common in superhero cinema, instead flooding the screen with vivid palettes. Neon blues, glowing greens, fiery reds, golden armors, all shimmered with intensity. At first it felt overwhelming, even gaudy. But as I surrendered to it, I realized that the excess was deliberate, a reflection of the ocean's own extravagance. The sea, after all, is filled with creatures more luminous and bizarre than any fantasy, and the film's colors mirror that truth. The saturation became a form of argument, that the ocean is not subtle but overwhelming, that beauty lies in excess as much as in restraint. The cinematography added another layer of strangeness. Wide-angle and fisheye lenses bent space, making rooms curve and faces warp. Disorienting perspective. Long tracking shots carried us through battles with fluidity that mimicked currents. I remember the camera sweeping across armies of crabs, diving alongside Arthur, soaring above battles as though itself a creature of the sea. These choices created a sense of immersion, making me feel less like a spectator and more like a swimmer pulled along by currents. At times I was dizzy, overwhelmed, but that too felt intentional. The ocean is not meant to be comfortable. It is vast, shifting, unsteady, and the camera forced me to experience that instability. Sound design deepened the impact of setting. Voices reverberated with aquatic distortion. Footsteps echoed strangely. The ambient hum of currents filled silences. Rupert Gregson-Williams' score wove orchestral themes with electronic pulses, creating a soundscape as hybrid as the visuals. I noticed how each setting seemed to carry its own sonic identity. The lighthouse quiet and grounded, Atlantis shimmering with layered echoes, the trench filled with screeches and silence. Listening closely, I realized that sound was doing as much work as image to make the world alive, to make me feel submerged in strangeness. Lighting, too, played its part. Scenes glowed with bioluminescent hues. Shadows stretched unnaturally, highlights sparkled like jewels. In battle sequences, explosions painted the ocean in flashes of orange and red, transforming the sea into both battlefield and canvas. In quieter moments, like Atlanta's reunion with Arthur, the lights soften into warmth, wrapping the characters in tenderness. This play of light and shadow mirrored emotional tone, guided my feelings as surely as dialogue or plot. What stays with me most, though, is how the settings and cinematic elements work together to embody contradiction. The lighthouse was simple yet profound, Atlantis extravagant yet fragile, the trench terrifying yet cathartic, Sicily joyful yet doomed. The camera bent space, the colors overwhelmed, the sound distorted, all conspiring to remind me that the world of this film, like our own, is not stable but shifting, not singular but multiple. In that instability lies its meaning, because it mirrors the contradictions of Arthur himself, half human, half Atlantean, reluctant and destined, playful and serious. By the end, I realized that the settings were characters in their own right, shaping the story and symbolizing its themes. The ocean is not merely where the story happens. It is a story, vast and strange, both cradle and battleground, both prison and possibility. The cinematic elements ensure that we feel this truth, that we are not allowed to sit comfortably on shore, but are pulled into the waves, forced to experience their beauty and terror alike. And in that immersion lies the film's strange magic. When I look past the dazzling surface of this film and peer into the work that went on behind the camera, I am struck by how much effort, invention, and sheer determination it took to bring such an impossible vision to life. The behind-the-scenes story is almost as strange and mythic as the tale itself, a reminder that what looks seamless on screen is born of wires, sweat, laughter, and risk. To understand how this film came to be is to appreciate not just the final spectacle, but the human labor that stitched it together, moment by moment. One of the most fascinating aspects was how James Wan approached the challenge of making people look like they were underwater without actually shooting them submerged for long stretches. Rather than endure the physical limitations of water tanks, the crew developed an elaborate system of rigs and harnesses. Actors were suspended by wires and encouraged to move as though buoyant, letting limbs drift in unnatural ways, while fans and subtle effects added the illusion of water resistance. Later, animators digitally enhanced these movements, adding floating hair, trailing fabrics, and the shimmer of bubbles. I remember reading about how awkward and exhausting it was for performers, dangling in midair while trying to act with conviction. Yet those struggles disappear on screen, transformed into fluid grace. For me, this remains one of the most telling insights, that the elegance of myth is born out of the awkwardness of reality. Jason Momoa's presence behind the scenes is another story in itself. Known for his exuberant personality, he reportedly filled the set with laughter and energy, blasting music between takes, performing haka dances, and encouraging cast and crew to loosen up. Amber Heard has spoken about how his playfulness made the grueling technical work bearable, how his refusal to take himself too seriously helped others endure the long hours of green screen acting. Yet when cameras rolled, he committed fully, channeling Arthur's reluctance and charisma with the same intensity he brought to play. I love imagining that contrast. The same man who made his colleagues laugh minutes earlier becoming the reluctant king in front of the lens. That duality mirrors the film's own blend of humor and grandeur, showing how tone was set not only in script but in spirit. Amber Heard's experience also reveals much about the challenges of production. She wore heavy, elaborate costumes designed to shimmer underwater, and she had to perform wire stunts while maintaining an illusion of effortless control. Reports suggest she trained extensively, both physically and mentally, to embody Mara's authority. Hearing her describe the difficulty of balancing on wires while delivering lines with conviction reminded me of the unseen discipline that goes into performance. On screen, she commands oceans. Off-screen, she endured grueling hours of physical restraint. That juxtaposition fascinates me because it reveals how much of cinema is about transforming strain into beauty. Patrick Wilson, playing ORM, leaned into the theatricality of his role, both on and off set. Crew members have recalled how he practiced his regal posture and booming delivery, even between takes, slipping into the cadence of a Shakespearean villain. His seriousness amused others, but also elevated the performance, setting a tone of conviction that made Ocean Master feel less like a campy title and more like a declaration of power. Behind the scenes, his intensity contrasted sharply with the playfulness of Momoa, creating a dynamic that mirrored their characters' rivalry. This parallel between on-set energy and narrative tension feels to me like one of those beautiful coincidences where life and art fold into one another. The production design team faced its own challenges. Vast sets were constructed on Australian sound stages, including Atlantean thrones, coral structures, and intricate temples. These were built practically, then extended digitally, creating the hybrid look that defines the film. Crew members described the disorientation of walking onto these sets, surrounded by glowing organic structures that look both real and surreal. I imagine the uncanny feeling of standing in a space that feels like a dream, designed to be believable yet otherworldly. That disorientation surely fed into performances, making actors feel the strangeness of their world even before visual effects were layered in. James Wan's horror background influenced more than just the trench sequence. On set, he reportedly encouraged his team to think of atmosphere first, spectacle second. Lighting was used to create mood, sound effects layered in early to shape tension, and even small movement of actors were carefully orchestrated to build unease. In the trench scene especially, practical effects, such as prosthetic suits for some of the monsters, were used as reference, giving actors something tangible to react to. I find this detail moving, because it shows that even in a film dominated by CGI, the director fought to ground moments in physical reality. That grounding is what makes the sequence feel so terrifying, because the actors were reacting not only to green screens but to shapes and textures they could see. Another curious behind-the-scenes fact is the casting of Julie Andrews as the voice of the Caravan. That choice was kept quiet during production, only revealed later, and it delighted audiences precisely because it was so unexpected. Behind the scenes, the decision reflected James Wan's love of surprising contrasts. He wanted the creature's voice to carry weight, authority, and a hint of maternal presence, and Andrews brought all of that. I can't help but smile at the thought of her recording lines for a monstrous sea beast, her elegant voice shaping one of the strangest creatures in superhero cinema. It is a reminder that behind the spectacle are artists taking playful risks. The stunt work also deserves mention. The rooftop chase in Sicily, one of the most exhilarating sequences, was achieved with extensive practical stunts. Actors and doubles leapt across real rooftops, with wires and cranes assisting, while explosions were carefully choreographed to collapse walls and tiles. Behind the scenes, the crew had to coordinate dozens of moving parts, from pyrotechnics to camera sweeps, all while preserving the illusion of spontaneity. Knowing how much planning went into a scene that looked chaotic on screen makes me admire it all the more. The chaos was artfully manufactured, every crumbling rooftop a testament to precision. Editing brought its own behind-the-scenes challenges. With so many subplots, kingdoms, and battles, early cuts were reportedly far longer and denser. James Wan and his editor spent months shaping the narrative, deciding what to trim, what to emphasize, and how to balance humor with grandeur. I find it fascinating that what we see, sprawling as it is, was once even larger. Behind the scenes, entire threads were cut away to keep the film coherent. A reminder how cinema is as much about subtraction as addition. What lingers with me most from these behind-the-scenes stories is the recognition that the film's strangeness was not accidental but cultivated. It was born of actors embracing discomfort, of designers building impossible sets, of directors drawing on horror and fantasy traditions, of technicians inventing new ways to simulate weightlessness. Behind every dazzling image lies the patience of a crew solving problems, the courage of actors risking absurdity, the creativity of artists willing to push past realism into the surreal. Reflecting on all of this, literature-loving friends, I feel a deep admiration not only for the film itself, but for the people who made it. The myth we saw on screen was built on a foundation of awkward rehearsals, heavy costumes, endless wires, and late-night edits. That truth does not diminish the magic, but enriches it, reminding us that behind every myth lies labor, behind every dream lies discipline. And in this case, the labor was as strange and bold as the story produced, a testament to what can happen when filmmakers dare to embrace the impossible. When I sit with this film not as spectacle but as story, what rises to the surface are its themes, the quiet arguments woven through its neon images, and the symbols that give those arguments weight. Beneath the humor, beneath the battles and excess, There is a tapestry of meaning that reveals itself to anyone willing to look closely. What I discovered as I lingered with it was a myth not only about a man who becomes king, but about belonging, contradiction, ecology, and the way mercy reshapes power. It is in these themes and symbols that the film transcends genre, offering us more than entertainment, offering us reflection. The theme of hybridity stands foremost, embodied in Arthur himself. Born of land and sea, human and Atlantean, he spends much of his life belonging fully to neither. His reluctance to take on the mantle of king comes not only from fear of responsibility, but from shame and alienation, the sense of being unwanted by both worlds. This theme resonates with anyone who has felt caught between cultures, classes, or identities, unsure where to stand. What struck me most was how the film refused to resolve this by erasing contradiction. Arthur does not become king by choosing one side over the other, but by embracing both, by transforming his hybridity from weakness into strength. The symbol of the trident captures this perfectly. A weapon of Atlantis reclaimed by a half-breed, transformed into a bridge between worlds. For me, that symbol carries profound resonance, a reminder that belonging does not always come from purity, but from the courage to embody contradiction. Another theme woven into the story is ecology, the relationship between humanity and the ocean. ORM's rage at the surface world's pollution, though twisted into tyranny, is grounded in truth. The ocean has indeed been poisoned, exploited, made into dumping ground. Arthur, raised by a lighthouse keeper who respected the sea, embodies a more balanced relationship, one of stewardship rather than domination. The battles between ORM and Arthur symbolize two responses to ecological crisis: rage that seeks revenge and reconciliation that seeks healing. What moved me was how the film dared to give its villain the stronger argument, forcing us to admit that his fury was justified even as his methods were cruel. The ocean itself becomes symbol here, vast, wounded, yet alive, demanding attention. Watching it, I felt reminded that stories, even in blockbuster form, can carry ecological urgency, can ask us to see the sea not as backdrop, but as character crying for care. Family and reconciliation form another thread. Arthur's bond with his father, his longing for his absent mother, his rivalry with his brother. These are not mere subplots, but emotional anchors. The lighthouse becomes symbol of parental love, simple and steadfast. The throne room of Atlantis becomes symbol of fractured family, a place where siblings clash, where mother is absent, where father's legacy is contested. The eventual reunion with Atlanta, the sparing of ORM's life, the embrace of his father, all these moments symbolize the healing of fractures. What I found striking was that Arthur's kingship is not legitimized by conquest alone, but by reconciliation, by the restoration of family bonds. In myth, the king often unites fractured realms. Here, he also unites fractured kin. That doubling deepens the symbolism, making kingship less about crown and more about forgiveness. Mercy itself becomes a powerful theme. When Arthur spares ORM, he breaks the cycle of vengeance that has defined Atlantean politics. Power, in this story, is redefined not as domination but as restraint, not as the ability to kill but the willingness to spare. This theme resonated deeply with me because it suggests that true kingship is measured not by victories but by mercy. The symbol of the trident, again, plays into this, a weapon wielded not to kill a brother but to stay his hand. In that act of mercy, Arthur transforms the trident from symbol of force into symbol of peace, an inversion that I found quietly radical. The descent into the trench carries symbolic weight of its own. As Arthur and Mara plunge into darkness, surrounded by swarms of monstrous creatures, they enact the archetypal descent into the underworld, the hero's confrontation with primal fear. The flare they carry becomes symbol of hope, a fragile light in overwhelming darkness. Emerging from the abyss into the hidden sea, Arthur proves himself not through violence, but through courage to endure terror. The symbolism here is ancient: light and darkness, courage and fear, life rising from death. I was struck by how powerfully the film embraced this archetype, unafraid to let its hero pass through nightmare before attaining destiny. Atlantis itself functions as symbol of both temptation and possibility. Its glowing towers dazzle, its armies impress. Yet beneath the beauty lies corruption, ambition, and cruelty. It symbolizes the allure of power, the danger of grandeur divorced from compassion. Arthur's task is not merely to claim it, but to redeem it, to transform from empire into kingdom. This theme reminded me that settings in cinema often carry symbolic charge, that worlds themselves can speak arguments. Atlantis, for all its beauty, is broken, and Arthur's kingship symbolizes the possibility of healing not only of family, but of empire itself. Even the creatures carry symbolic weight. The Kara, then, feared by all, symbolizes the voice of the silenced, the power ignored by the arrogant. Only Arthur, humble enough to listen, can hear it. That humility becomes his true strength, symbolizing a redefinition of power from domination to understanding. The trench creatures symbolize chaos and fear. The brine army symbolizes primal force. The fishermen symbolize art and grace. Each kingdom, each creature, becomes archetype, piece of a symbolic map of the ocean soul. Watching them, I felt as though I were reading an illuminated manuscript, each image carrying allegorical meaning, each battle a metaphor. The film also weaves in the theme of destiny versus choice. Arthur is told he is destined to be king, yet he resists, jokes, avoids. What gives meaning to his eventual acceptance is not that destiny compels him, but that he chooses it. The trident does not leap into his hand unbidden. He must claim it, must prove worthy. This distinction matters, because it suggests that destiny is not fate imposed, but possibility embraced. The symbol of the trident again captures this, an object waiting for the one who chooses to take it, not the one to whom it is forced. For me, this theme elevates the story, reminding us that greatness is never only inherited but chosen. Finally, the theme of reconciliation with nature flows through the imagery. Arthur's ability to command sea creatures, to harmonize with the caravan, symbolizes a relationship not of domination but of communion. He does not enslave the ocean. He listens to it, speaks with it, partners with it. This is a powerful inversion of the usual myth, where heroes conquer beasts to prove strength. Here, the hero proves strength by listening. The symbolism is ecological, spiritual, and political all at once. It whispers a truth we need in our own age, that the world is not ours to master, but to reconcile with. As I linger on these themes and symbols, literature-loving friends, I realize that the excess of this film is not without purpose. Beneath the neon, beneath the chaos, it is telling a story about hybridity, ecology, family, mercy, destiny, and reconciliation. Its symbols, the trident, the lighthouse, the flare in the trench, the Carathan's voice, are luminous with meaning, waiting for us to read them. And in reading them, we discover that even a superhero blockbuster can carry truths as ancient as myth, truths that speak to our fractured, wounded, hopeful world. When I look closely at the mechanics of how this film was built, I realize that its strangeness, its grandeur, and even its excess all come from a deliberate set of filmmaking techniques, crafted with care and sometimes with audacity. It is easy to be swept away by the glowing palaces and roaring battles, but when I stop and ask how it all came to be, I find choices that reveal a fascinating philosophy of cinema. That bigger is not always careless, that spectacle can still carry meaning, and that even box office triumphs are born of artistic risk. To understand this film, we must look not only at what is told, but at how it is told, and at how the world responded when it finally arrived in theaters. One of the most distinctive techniques was the way James Wan chose to film action. Rather than lean into shaky, fragmented shots, he often favored sweeping, unbroken camera movements that carried us through battles and fluid arcs. I remember the rooftop chase in Sicily, where the camera glided through windows, soared across rooftops, and followed characters in long takes that felt more like ballet than brawl. These choices created not only spectacle but rhythm, immersing us in movement rather than cutting it apart. The technique mirrors the ocean itself, fluid, continuous, relentless, and in doing so, the form reflects the story's content. That poetic resonance struck me as one of the most subtle achievements of the film. The use of lenses added another layer of strangeness. Wide-angle and fisheye lenses bent space, making settings feel distorted, curved, uncanny. Close-ups warped faces into mythic exaggerations, while sweeping shots bent architecture into dreamlike forms. These distortions unsettled me at times, but I realized they were deliberate, meant to make us feel the instability of the underwater world. Nothing beneath the surface is solid. Everything shifts, floats, distorts. By bending perspective, The film made me experience that instability viscerally. It was not always comfortable, but that discomfort was part of the immersion. Lighting and color design were equally crucial techniques. Rejecting the muted tones of many modern superhero films, Wan and his team embraced saturation. Neon blues, glowing greens, fiery reds, golden armors. The screen pulsed with excess, almost daring us to look away. At first it felt garish, even overwhelming, but as I surrendered to it, I realized it was part of film philosophy. The ocean is not subtle. It is riotous, luminous, filled with creatures more extravagant than fantasy. The color palette became a statement. That beauty lies in abundance, that myth does not have to be restrained, be meaningful. I was reminded of illuminated manuscripts and stained glass, art forms that revel in color as devotion. Here, cinema embraced the same excess, turning each frame into a kind of prayer to the ocean's extravagance. Sound design worked in tandem with image to complete immersion. Voices carried aquatic reverb. Movements were accompanied by subtle whooshes of current. Silence was filled with the hum of deep water. The score by Rupert Gregson-Williams blended orchestral themes with electronic pulses, creating a hybrid soundscape that mirrored Arthur's hybrid identity. Each kingdom seemed to carry its own sonic identity. The fisherman with elegance, the brine with primal pounding, Atlantis with shimmering echoes. I found myself listening as closely as watching, realizing that the soundscape was doing as much work as the visuals to make me believe in a world beneath the waves. Editing also deserves attention. With so many subplots, kingdoms, and tonal shifts, the danger of incoherence loomed. Yet the editors balanced humor, romance, horror, and spectacle with surprising fluidity. Cuts lingered long enough to savor design, but quickened during action, allowing rhythm to guide emotion. I later learned that early cuts were far longer, and what we saw was already trimmed and distilled. This fascinated me, because what feels sprawling on screen was once even more excessive. Editing here was less about restraint than about shaping chaos into rhythm, making abundance feel like crescendo rather than cacophony. Even the integration of practical and digital effects reflects deliberate technique. While much of the world is CGI, practical sets, thrones, rooftops, temples, were built to give weight and texture. Costumes were physical, shimmering with scales and armor, later enhanced digitally. Stunts were practical, with wires and pyrotechnics, later extended with effects. This hybrid method mirrors Arthur himself, half real, half digital, half human, half Atlantean. The filmmaking technique itself embodies the story's theme of hybridity, a form reflecting its content in ways that delighted me once I noticed it. All these techniques came together to create a film that was not merely spectacle but strange poetry, an argument in form as much as in story. Yet the story of its box office reveals another truth, that audiences around the world were ready to embrace this strangeness. Released in late 2018, the film entered a superhero landscape dominated by Marvel and struggling DC properties. Many doubted its prospects, dismissing Aquaman as a second-tier hero mocked for his powers. And yet, when the film opened, it defied expectations, becoming the highest-grossing DC film of the time, surpassing even The Dark Knight Rises. The numbers themselves are staggering. Globally, the film earned over $1.1 billion, with China alone contributing an enormous share, making it one of the rare Hollywood films to achieve such dominance overseas. In the United States, its box office was strong, but it was the international market that truly crowned a success. This fact fascinates me because it suggests that its visual language, excessive, mythic, saturated, spoke to audiences across cultures, less tied to American specificity and more to universal themes of belonging and destiny. The techniques that some critics mocked as gaudy turned out to be strengths in the global marketplace, proving that strangeness can be a bridge rather than a barrier. The critical box office narrative also shaped the legacy of DC films. After years of uneven reception, Aquaman proved that DC could succeed not by imitating Marvel's tone, but by embracing its own strangeness. The triumph gave James Wan enormous credibility, turning him into one of the most bankable directors in Hollywood. It also reshaped Aquaman's cultural image, from a mock character to a billion-dollar icon. I find this transformation symbolic in itself. A ridiculed hero redeemed by spectacle, much as Arthur himself is redeemed by embracing his hybrid nature. The box office became a mirror of the story, both telling us that outcasts can become kings. Reflecting on all of this, literature-loving friends, I realize that the filmmaking techniques and the box office triumph are not separate threads, but part of the same fabric. The techniques, sweeping camera, bent lenses, neon palettes, aquatic sound, create a film that dared to be strange. The box office revealed that audiences were hungry for that very strangeness, that what critics saw as excess others saw as wonder. Together, they tell us something profound, that cinema, even at its most commercial, can still be art, can still carry risk, can still surprise us with beauty born of excess. And perhaps that is the greatest triumph of this film, that its success was not achieved by compromise but by audacity. When I think about how this film resonated beyond the screen, I cannot help but return to the cast who embodied it, the words they shared in interviews, and the voices of audiences who claimed it as their own. For me, these elements are not appendices to the film but part of its living legacy, because they show how art continues to breathe after its release, shaped by those who made it and those who received it. To listen to the cast speak is to glimpse the spirit behind the performances. To listen to audiences is to understand how myth is woven into collective imagination. Together, these voices form a chorus that tells us what the film truly meant. Jason Momoa, at the center of it all, spoke often about what Aquaman meant to him personally. In interviews, he admitted that he knew the character had long been mocked in popular culture, treated as lesser in the pantheon of heroes. That very reputation made the role a challenge he relished. To take a ridiculed figure and reveal his depth, Momoa emphasized how his own heritage informed his portrayal. As a man of Polynesian descent, he connected to the ocean not as abstract backdrop, but as lived reality, a cultural inheritance. He often spoke about wanting children who looked like him to see a hero who resembled them, who carried their history into myth. I was moved by this, because it revealed that behind the bravado and humor lay a quiet seriousness, a recognition that representation matters. His interviews made me see his performance not just as acting, but as cultural offering, an attempt to reclaim dignity for both Aquaman and for marginalized voices in cinema. Amber Heard, who played Mera, spoke about the discipline required to embody a character both warrior and guide. She described long hours of training, of learning how to fight convincingly on wires, of finding authority while suspended awkwardly in harnesses. In interviews, she emphasized that Mera was not a psychic, but an equal, a woman with her own power, intelligence, and will. She expressed pride in portraying a female character who was neither damsel nor muse but partner and fighter. Listening to her, I realized that her pride came from knowing that such portrayals still matter, that audiences hunger for heroines who act rather than wait to be rescued. Patrick Wilson, who gave us ORM, revealed in interviews how much he enjoyed leaning into theatricality. He spoke about drawing inspiration from Shakespearean villains, about the joy of speaking lines with conviction, even when they seemed over the top. He admitted that Ocean Master might sound absurd, but insisted on delivering it with sincerity, trusting that audiences would feel his conviction. His words fascinated me because they revealed a philosophy of performance, that even camp can become myth if spoken with enough belief. Wilson's seriousness became part of what made ORM compelling, a villain we could laugh at yet also respect. Willem Dafoe, in his quiet way, brought gravitas to Volko. In interviews, he reflected on the challenge of playing a mentor figure in a world of neon spectacle. He said he wanted Volko to feel grounded, a man of patience and wisdom amid chaos. Listening to him, I understood how much his understated performance anchored the film, giving Arthur a guide who was believable even when surrounded by glowing palaces and shark armies. Dafoe's reflections reminded me that myth needs its quiet voices as much as its loud ones, its mentors as much as its warriors. Nicole Kidman, portraying Atlanta, spoke movingly about the maternal dimension of her role. She said she was drawn to the story because it was about a mother's sacrifice and eventual return, about the power of love to transcend exile. In her interviews, she described how she wanted Atlanta's absence to haunt Arthur even when she was off-screen, so that her return would feel like release. Hearing her say this deepened my appreciation for her performance, which managed to make even brief scenes feel luminous with tenderness. Beyond the cast, the voices of audiences tell their own story. Many fans, especially those from coastal and island cultures, spoke about how much it meant to see a hero who embodied connection to the sea. Polynesian and Pacific Islander communities, in particular, celebrated Momoa's casting, seeing in him a reflection of their own myths and traditions. Online forums filled with pride and excitement, not only for the spectacle, but for the resonance of cultural representation. This struck me as one of the most important aspects of the film's reception, that it gave visibility to identities too often absent from Hollywood myth-making. Audience reviews also revealed how deeply people responded to the film's extravagance. Some wrote with glee about how gloriously weird it was, how they loved the crab armies and neon palaces precisely because they were absurd. Others celebrated its sincerity, saying it dared to be earnest in an age of cynicism. A recurring theme was surprise. Many admitted they had expected little from Aquaman, only to be swept away by its spectacle and heart. That sense of discovery, of being proved wrong by joy, shaped its legacy. For me, these reviews matter because they showed that audiences were not only willing to accept strangeness, but hungry for it. Of course, not all reviews were glowing. Some viewers echoed critics in finding the film too long, too chaotic, too overwhelming. They complained of sensory overload, of tonal inconsistency. Yet even negative reviews often carried a tone of fascination, as though the film's flaws were inseparable from its daring. Very few dismissed it as forgettable. Even detractors admitted it was unlike anything else in the genre. That in itself is revealing, because forgettability is often a worse fate than mockery. Better be remembered as excessive than ignored as mediocre. What I carry with me from these voices, cast and audience alike, is the recognition that the film's meaning lies not only in what is seen on screen, but in what it provoked in people. For Jason Momoa, it meant reclaiming dignity for a mocked hero and for his heritage. For Amber Heard, it meant embodying female strength with pride. For Patrick Wilson, it meant playing camp as if it were scripture. For Nicole Kidman, it meant inhabiting maternal sacrifice. For audiences, it meant surprise, joy, representation, and a reminder that cinema can still astonish. As I reflect on all this, literature-loving friends, I realize that myth does not end when credits roll. It continues in how actors speak of their roles, in how audiences carry the story into their lives, and how critics debate its meaning. The cast gave the film their voices, the audiences gave it their hearts, and together they made it more than entertainment. They made it memory, legacy, cultural artifact. And in those voices we hear the echo of what myth has always been. Not static tale, but living conversation, handed down, argued over, embraced, and transformed. As I come to the end of my reflections on this strange and extravagant film, I realize that what stays with me most is not a single scene or a single performance, but the way it dared to be what so few blockbusters allow themselves to be, unapologetically excessive, unashamedly earnest, and unafraid of contradiction. Aquaman 2018 could have been another generic chapter in a crowded superhero genre, a film that played it safe with muted tones and predictable arcs. Instead, it became a neon fever dream, a myth wrapped in spectacle, a story about belonging told to armies of crabs and monstrous sea creatures, a narrative that somehow balanced humor, horror, romance, and politics without ever flattening into sameness. It was, in the truest sense, a modern epic, flawed, unruly, yet filled with truths that only emerge when a story dares to risk everything. I think about Arthur Curry, the reluctant half-breed who becomes king not by suppressing contradiction, but by embracing it. His hybridity, once mocked, becomes his strength. His mercy, once dismissed as weakness, becomes his crown. In his journey, I see a mirror of what this film itself accomplished. It took what was ridiculed and redeemed it. It took what was thought second-tier and made it sovereign. Aquaman, long the butt of jokes, rose to mythic stature. And in that transformation, I see a metaphor for all of us who have felt underestimated, misjudged, cast aside. Watching Arthur stand at last as bridge between land and sea, I felt the quiet power of a story telling me, you too can make fracture into strength. You too can reconcile contradictions within yourself. The settings, too, haunt me still. The lighthouse with its steady beam, symbol of love and memory. Atlantis with its neon towers, symbol of grandeur both dazzling and corrupt. The trench with its swarming monsters, symbol of fear faced and overcome. Sicily with its rooftops, symbol of fleeting happiness and inevitable loss. These are not mere places, but emblems of life itself, reminders that we live between light and storm, beauty and terror, joy and sorrow. To wander through them again in memory is to remember that cinema, at its best, is not about escape, but about recognition. Even the filmmaking techniques speak to me as symbols. The sweeping cameras that mimic currents, the bent lenses that distort space, the neon colors that overwhelm, the aquatic soundscapes that reverberate, all of them remind me that perception itself is unstable, that truth is refracted through perspective. Watching the film was less about seeing clearly than about being immersed, less about grasping certainty than about surrendering to flow. And in that surrender lies wisdom, that life, like the ocean, cannot be controlled, only navigated. The themes we trace still shimmer in my mind. Hybridity as strength, ecology as warning, family as reconciliation, mercy as power, destiny as choice, reconciliation with nature as the true crown. These are not small themes, but ancient ones, carried here not in solemn epics, but in a superhero tale dressed in neon armor. That, to me, is the film's strangest and greatest achievement. To take truths as old as myth and deliver them through crab armies and giant sea monsters, to whisper ancient wisdom to the loudness of spectacle. It is as if the film itself is saying that truth can wear many costumes, that wisdom can arrive disguised as excess. And then there are the voices beyond the screen. The actors who spoke of pride and challenge, the audiences who found representation and joy, the critics who argued over beauty and chaos. These voices remind me that myth is not fixed, but living, carried forward in conversation, reinterpreted by each generation. Aquaman is no longer just a comic book hero mocked for talking fish. He is a billion-dollar icon, a symbol of belonging, a reminder that even the ridicule can rise. That transformation belongs not only to filmmakers, but to all who watched, argued, laughed, and believed. As I close my reflections, literature-loving friends, I feel gratitude for what this film dared to be. It dared to be strange, and in its strangeness it became true. It dared to be excessive, and in its excess it became beautiful. It dared to be mocked, and in its audacity it became myth. For me, that is enough to keep it alive in memory, not as flawless masterpiece, but as unforgettable journey, a reminder that cinema, like the ocean, is at its best when it refuses to be small. If you found joy in this journey, if you felt the pull of myth beneath the neon waves, I would be grateful if you could like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join me again for more reflections on film and literature. Your presence, as always, makes this conversation alive.